Okay, so our larger theme at the moment is ideas and concepts, and particularly the implication of ideas for sensing with soul, how the ideas we have influence. We talked about how the ideas that we inherit, if you like, often operate unconsciously and influence or limit or open certain directions of experience and understanding, sensing with soul or not, etc. And we touched on that. So ideas unconsciously have that power. Consciously too, they have that power, of course. And so, want to be talking about that, like what does it mean to incorporate an idea so that it influences the sensing or opens the sensing or makes this or that possible in the sensing with soul. Excuse me. Part of all that I'd like to weave in is just the relationship between ideas and images, between eidos and ikon, the relationship of ideas or the place of ideas in sensing with soul. And some of what I want to weave in over the course of the next few talks is also what does it mean to meditate on an idea or with an idea? What does that mean? What might that look like for us and involve for us? So all of that, and I want to point out certain possibilities, so specific possibilities, and discuss them, if that's possible. But let's start with, in the course of discussing certain possibilities and opening up these specific practices, we'll start with the relatively familiar. What will probably be relatively familiar for many of you. But before we even get going with that, it's important to point out, that when I'm using the word idea, sometimes people very easily take that to mean something only or mostly abstract. So it's a certain thought, and it kind of happens in your head in a kind of way that's abstracted, taken away from the world, or particularly the world of perception. So unfortunately, just the way we tend to think about ideas and ideation in our larger culture is not a way that allows them very easily to translate into actual ways of looking, into meditations, into perception, into sensing. But that is what I'm really talking about. I'm not really per se that much interested in just ideas that remain purely abstract. What I'm really wanting to point to is that ideas can, or many ideas can, and in our case they should, translate into actual ways of looking that are operating in the moment to open or shape the sensing in particular ways. So this skill to be able to translate ideas into the perception, to hold them subtly at the back of the mind, so to speak, so that they become ways of looking, is such an important skill as a human being. I mean, in terms of practice and what can be possible in practice. And sometimes I think I slightly overestimate just what's involved in just making that transition, or just understanding, for people to understand that's what we're talking about. So really right from the start, that's what we're talking about. When we say ideas, it's for the sake of their implementation as in ways of looking to open up the whole sense of existence, as an actual sense, in the actual senses, not abstracted. So it's interesting. I don't know. I was thinking a while ago about the word reflection. that word also suggests that through an idea or a concept, the looking, and so that what is perceived in the looking is reflected according to that idea or concept. So we say I reflect on an idea, or I reflect on this or that, and we tend to think of cogitation, mental cogitation, but the idea also, or the word reflection, may have kind of intimations of this idea of reflecting. So what is how the world is reflected is through an idea, or ideas. The idea is part of what forms the way of looking at any time, as I said, and we want to be very agile with that, nimble and facile and dexterous with that. There's a limitation, obviously, to using that word reflection, because it implies a world that's independently existing, that is then reflected in this way according to this idea, or in that way according to another idea. And our logos, our larger conceptual frame, is more in favour of the create-discover model. But that works too, this idea of reflecting that way. So ideas, when we talk about ideas, concepts, we're talking about something that needs to somehow become a way of looking. It needs to be translated incorporated literally into a way of looking. And then that way of looking can refine and deepen, can be refined and be deepened. So this goes for any way of looking. So we could take anything as an example, but when we get to talking about meditation on ideas, it's just like any way of looking meditation, they need to be kind of not too clunky or not gross, or move on from the clunky and gross into the more subtle. It needs to be able to refine, deepen, become more subtle, and in a way to involve more and more of the being and the levels of the being and the levels of perception. So that goes for that's the kind of the possibility of meditation to deepen, to refine, etc. So, for example, one could have a practice of, say, giving my aggregates to the divinity, to a god or the gods, or the divine, or the Buddha nature, or whatever. And that's the practice that one might be doing at some time, and perhaps one is tired at the time one is doing that, so including the tiredness as part of the aggregates that are present, one gives that to the divine. When the sense of self, the I, that is giving in that way and that is experiencing the tiredness, when the divine and when the tiredness itself are all somehow or other seen as empty, or more empty, or less substantial, more transparent, or void, or whatever we want to say, in some way or other, through some way of looking, some other way of looking that's kind of operating at the same time, that sees their emptiness. So there's a larger practice there of giving the aggregates to the divine, or perhaps back to the divine, the divinity. But part of that is that self, divine, and aggregates, including perhaps what everyone is struggling with, or what everyone is feeling joy over, or enjoying, all are in some way seen as empty. So in a way, there's a larger way of looking, and a kind of another way of looking, the seeing the emptiness somehow or other to some level that's wrapped up in that larger way of looking. Or you could say it's an amalgamation of a few different ways of looking. But when we do that, for example, so it's not just giving my aggregates to the divine, the divinity, it's actually gone to another level by virtue of some degree of emptiness, perception being involved in the giving, in who's giving and what's being given and who it's being given to. then, when that's the case, then the whole movement, the whole gesture, and the whole sense of that idea of, if we call it an idea of giving my aggregates to the divinity, it deepens. It's deepened by that, and actually becomes much more freeing and much more beautiful, and will feel more sacred, generally speaking. So the point really, I could have picked any example, but the point really is that there's always this kind of possibility of any way of looking, whether it seems obviously to involve an idea or not, to deepen, to refine, to become more subtle, etc., and also to become more comprehensive. So this is possible for most meditations, any way of looking, meditation on an idea, meditation on an image. If we talk about incorporating emptiness into it, well then there's this, as I alluded to, there's a kind of spectrum, if you like, of how much emptiness is included or how deep it goes, and anywhere on that spectrum is available as a sort of variation on the larger way of looking. And similarly, actually, we could say if the whole thing is seen as image, imaginally, and then the middle way of the imaginal is there, and this neither real nor not real, it will function in a similar way to the emptiness to allow more beauty, more sacredness, become more freeing, etc. If that's in that example of giving my aggregates to the divinity. So. And I think I've mentioned this before at some point on a retreat, and I can't remember, perhaps on the re-enchanting retreat, but if we were, just because I mentioned that example of giving the aggregates to the divinity, if we were meditating with, let's say, receiving, say, love or light or whatever from a divinity, then I would say that rather than sort of being more interested in more emptiness, incorporating more emptiness into the whole gestalt of the view, it's actually quite important when we receive love from a divinity in the meditation to explore all the positions on the self spectrum. In other words, a very solid, contracted, reified self-sense. It's really important that that self-sense, because it's often quite a suffering self-sense, it's really important that self-sense puts itself or feels itself in the stream and bathed in the stream of the divine light, the divine love, whatever. That's very, very useful to include that more solid self-sense and views. But also the less solid senses of self. It's all important. Yeah. So, but generally, there's this possibility in any way of looking for it to refine and deepen and kind of open up in that way. So. Back to this idea, or rather wrapped up in what we just said, is this idea that ideas, when we're talking about ideas, need to come into the way of looking, and for that they need to be a bit more subtle. They can't be too gross, or rather, for the way of looking to be agile and actually to be able to work in the moment and with different conditions and to go deep, the way that the idea is incorporated has to be quite subtle. So sometimes, as an example, we could take the whole idea or conceptual framework of dependent origination that the Buddha came up with 12 links, or sometimes it's 10 links, or sometimes 13, or whatever. But let's say 12 links. And that whole conceptual framework is really a network of ideas. And what I've noticed teaching this in different situations with people is that oftentimes people really seem to enjoy kind of the categorization of their experience. So there might be one way I can do it sometimes with a group of people is to sort of look back on some whole scenario of dukkha that transpired, perhaps in a social situation or work situation, whatever, and kind of use that grid of concepts in the dependent origination, the 12 links there, and sort of file things or categorize things. When that happened, that was a sankhara in the form of previous belief structure or expectation or conditioning, and when that moment happened, it was the shrinking of the consciousness, and when that moment happened, that was the aversion to the unpleasantness in the contact, etc. So people seem to really quite enjoy kind of doing a bit of a post-mortem on some kind of suffering, or even just a categorization of some kind of made-up situation. And there's a way that, that's helpful because it helps digest that conceptual framework and the concepts that make it up at a certain level. But that to me is not a full enough understanding. We can have a feeling, I've touched on this before, we can have a kind of, we enjoy the feeling, or many of us do as human beings, when we sort of fitted this experience to that concept, and we sort of broken things down. We found a sort of way that we can file all the words of what we find in the text and what the Buddha is talking about, and we file it, and it means this, and that translated as this, in that situation it meant that thing, and there's a kind of relatively neat filing away of all the concepts, and we can kind of sometimes enjoy that and mistake it for the kind of level of understanding that's really going to be liberating, which goes beyond that. So certainly not just post-mortems on our suffering that has already transpired. It's not really going to help that much, but nor is this just sort of the satisfaction of neatly putting concepts in boxes and neatly mapping them to sort of circumscribed experiences or movements of consciousness or whatever in our life. So it can be useful, but actually, again, what we need to do is live an understanding of dependent origination in ways that liberate, and that means translate that to actually not just a way of looking, lots of ways of looking in the moment. There's a whole, as I said, network of concepts there, and all the links and all the interconnections, so many, many possible ways of looking are available from that classic Buddhist teaching of the Buddhist classic teaching of dependent origination. And again, if we take that map of dependent origination, that network of concepts, that conceptual framework, and what can often happen is that someone even doesn't just stop at a kind of relatively gross intellectual categorization of what might happen. And they don't just stop even with a relatively gross labeling in the present moment of what's going on. Ah, yes, there's aversion here, or whatever. Ah, yes, there's greed here, or something like that. Ah, yes, there's selfing here. That kind of observation will be helpful if I catch it in the moment. Ah, there's selfing here, or there's greed or aversion. That's going to be, it may be relatively helpful, just there's enough mindfulness there to not get completely sucked into something. It may create a bit of more spaciousness, a bit of a break-up of the momentum of the sort of samsaric flow, if you like. But there's the possibility of much more, as a subtle wielding of the concepts involved, much more subtly incorporated into ways of looking. In a much more fluid and agile way. And so someone might take it to another level and, for instance, look at the link between Vedana and Tanha, Vedana and craving, and have a practice derived from that map of dependent origination and that particular link between Vedana and craving, have a practice of stationing the awareness on, let's say, unpleasant Vedana, or pleasant Vedana, whatever, and stationing the awareness on the Vedana and observing moment to moment the rapid changing of the Vedana itself, and just being, or just being with the Vedana, and in that kind of intensity and acuity of attention on the Vedana, there's a marked stopping down, or even a marked slowing down or attenuation, let's say, of how much the Vedana gives, how much craving the Vedana then gives rise to, either in aversion or desire to have more or to hold on to. So it's a very specific way of looking. Stay at the Vedana, focus on the Vedana as they're happening right now, and that very focusing, even if it doesn't have a contemplation of impermanence, just seeing pleasant, unpleasant, pleasant, 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 whatever it is, that will attenuate the craving that comes out of that. So I've talked and written about this in the past. Very skillful practice, stationing the awareness on the Vedana. Some people, though, take that as the kind of the pinnacle of what's possible in as a way of looking that might come out of the 12 links of the map of the 12 links of dependent origination. And there I would say, well, actually a lot more is possible, and a lot more subtle than that, and a lot more liberating than that. Some people even would say that that is what the experience of an arahant is that Vedana arises, unpleasant or pleasant, whatever, and there's no craving. And this kind of practice that we can do of stationing the focus of attention on the Vedana, and thus the craving being attenuated through the intensity and the steadiness of that gaze on the Vedana. Some people would say that's practicing the way an arahant would see anyway, the way an arahant would experience anyway. That's practicing a state of liberation or arahantship or whatever. But then what can often happen is quite a lot gets clung to in there or stopped. One is the view of what awakening is, and the other is what is possible from the or through the translation of that those concepts in dependent origination that the Buddha outlined into ways of looking. One limits because one stopped somewhere, and so that's it. That's kind of what I need to see now. Everything else, there's not much more there, and one has stopped the possibilities for this translation of concept and idea into way of looking there. One of the things I feel is very important as a general statement is that all these Dharma categories, so for example, those 12 links of dependent origination, avijja, sankhara, jhana, so delusion, fabrications, fabricating forces, consciousness, etc., perception, all the rest of it, craving. To me, they are, and to many, or at least some Dharma teachers and Buddhist teachers in the history of the wider tradition, they are not truths, they are not ultimate truths. They are these categories, these Dharma categories, so the 12 links there of dependent origination, the 3 kilesas, or the 5 aggregates, or awakening, or whatever, they all, first of all, again, we can notice how they've been translated and shifted in given different interpretations in different points in the history of Buddhism and different locations in the dissemination of Buddhism over the globe. But more importantly, they're also empty. They are realized to them. We can realize that they themselves do not have inherent existence. So they are not truths. These 12 links, these 5 aggregates, etc., these 3 kilesas, they're not ultimate truths. Even the Theravadan tradition, Ajahn Mahabua used to say, everything that's involved in the Four Noble Truths is a relative truth. And the 12 links of dependent origination are the Buddha's longhand version of the second noble truth, the causes for the arising of dukkha. Craving being the shorthand version, or clinging being the shorthand version, but the longhand version is dependent origination in that model. And Ajahn Mahabua says this is all relative truth. When you take the raft of the Four Noble Truths and that teaching of dependent origination, you go beyond it. So to me, there's a whole other level here, way beyond that stationing of the attention at Vedana, where all the links of dependent origination begin to kind of melt through actually contemplating the very mechanism of dependent origination and what it is. It's as if you take that teaching, you take it a deeper and deeper and deeper level. I used to say like a snake, it's like a snake swallowing its own tail. Maybe better to say is they melt, those concepts melt under the gaze of the understanding of dependent origination, which is the understanding of emptiness. So they're not truths, they're rafts, they're part of the raft of what the Buddha talked about. They're skillful means, they're relative truths that can be helpful when they are translated into ways of looking. The worst thing would be to cling to them intellectually as truths and statements about, this is my philosophical position on what life is. They haven't actually become really fertile and really taken this journey into depth and radicality that they can when they're translated into ways of looking that bring a kind of levels of freedom dependent on the levels in which that translation has actually been worked by the practitioner. So as an example, and I don't know whether I've mentioned this anywhere else in a talk, but the three kilesas were picked out, the three defilements. Sometimes they call, the Buddha used to say, these are three fires, you have to put them out. Greed, aversion, delusion. In a way, he was responding to the spiritual culture at his time in India, which was dominated by the Vedic teachings and the Brahminical teachings. And in the Vedic and Brahminical religions, they used to burn three fires, and the idea was to keep them burning. The Buddha came along and said, no, you've got to put them out. Now, we could say, well, if he happened to be in a different spiritual culture or time where they had, say, 4 fires or 2 fires, would that have shaped his teaching of the Dharma? Would he say there are 4 or 2 kilesas? Because he was really kind of spinning something taken for granted in people's spiritual understanding. He was just spinning it the other way, kind of the way Jesus would do when he says in different teachings of his, it's a kind of, hey, think about this. So, you see the kind of historical conditioning even of the original Buddhist teachings there. So, from many angles, we can see these Dharma concepts are not absolute ultimate truth. They're just, they're for the sake of becoming ways of looking. They're optional lenses that we can put down, pick up and kind of go for a ride on. Sometimes I call them avenues, which is something I'll come to in a minute. So we use them to suggest, or so that they become ways of looking, ways of sensing, and something like the teaching of dependent origination with those links, as I said, there's a whole plethora of potential ways of looking that can be extracted or constructed from those concepts there, taken at different levels. Many, and I've talked about that elsewhere. Actually, that leads me on to something else. I said I would start with some familiar ideas, and so we touched on dependent origination. didn't really mean to go into that so much. But what about the three characteristics? Tilakana in Pali, Trilakshana in Sanskrit. The three characteristics, sometimes called the three marks of existence, has become quite a common sort of Buddhist categories. So dukkha, anicca, and anatta. Dukkha meaning suffering or unsatisfactoriness, really, we could say. Anicca, impermanence. And anatta, usually translated either as not self, or not belonging to a self. Sometimes it's translated as there is no self, and occasionally it's translated to refer to what I would call as the emptiness of inherent existence of phenomena. But the thing that I want to open up, and some of you will be familiar with me saying this from before, so there's this relatively familiar Buddhist concept. What I would like to open up is just to point out that we can relate to these three characteristics, three marks, as facts, as realities or truths. The truth of everything is that it is dukkha. The truth of so even if something is pleasant, it's not going to be finally satisfactory, and hence it's unsatisfactory. The truth of anything at all is that it's impermanent and it's not self, or etc. It doesn't belong to myself. So we can take them as facts, these three characteristics, and kind of just make that a kind of either just a kind of abstract philosophy, or a kind of attitude to life, or take them as facts and plug them in as meditations and go a bit deeper than just a kind of general life attitude. But the point is, they're in as facts, they're part of what some modern philosophers call the facticity of our existence. Again, that the sort of unavoidable, hard realities of our existential predicament: unsatisfactoriness, impermanence, and this absence of a kind of self-essence to ourselves. So one can look at them as facts and part of the facticity of our existential situation, or one can pick up these three characteristics as ways of looking, and then they have to be meditative lenses, meditative tools, and it will turn out meditative avenues. So I pointed out elsewhere that the Buddha, so oftentimes they're given, they are referred to, this anicca, dukkha, and anatta, dukkha, anicca, anatta, are referred to as three characteristics, or three marks, lakkhana or lakshana in Sanskrit. But sometimes the Buddha referred to them, or when he was talking about them, he talked more in terms of what I would call a way of looking. So he talks about dukkha, anicca, and anatta sanya, perception, perceiving in those terms, or dukkha, anicca, or anatta anupassana, which means a kind of observing, looking at, contemplating, considering, or viewing. Passana, anupassana, is to view, which would translate very well to ways of looking, as a way of looking. So anicca as a way of looking. What does that mean? And you're probably familiar with my teachings about this. And it's like looking, plugged into, focusing on, attentive to, interested primarily in that moment, the impermanence of things, and just sustaining that as a lens. All I'm interested in now is the impermanence. And it might be long-scale impermanence, the impermanence of vast stretches of time, or ordinary time scales, or very, very micro time scales. But all I'm wanting to see over and over when I've got that way of looking, those lenses on, is impermanence. Or anatta, just not self, not me, not mine. And I just sustain that for a period, half an hour, 10 minutes, an hour, whatever it is. And what happens? Where does it take me? It's a way of looking rather than a truth. So as I employ it as a way of looking, I let it unfold. I don't a priori fix a limit on what I will see, or what that lens will reveal to me. And similarly with dukkha, it's just unsatisfactory, and there's another way of doing it I'm not going to go into now. Then the question becomes, when I look this way, what happens to my experience? What happens to appearances? What happens to perception? And so what we have here, on the one side, the possibility of taking them as facts, these three characteristics. And then what will happen? Well, if I plug them in, I could not plug them in, as I could leave them abstract, or I could plug them in to my, as a way of looking, but I've decided that they're facts, that they're, and I've kind of, in that way, kind of put a limit on them. And so there will be some degree of less fabricated, certainly less clinging, because when I see things are unsatisfactory, I just let go. I'm going through this very quickly, there's much more, but I've been through it elsewhere so many times, I'm not going to repeat it here. There will be a little less clinging, somewhat less clinging, maybe quite a lot less clinging, and less fabrication of perception. When I leave them a little more open-ended and I employ these ways of looking, then there can be actually a lot less fabrication. I kind of really go on a journey with these ways of looking, and I begin to see, really, and because I'm set up by adopting what we're calling the phenomenological approach, I'm set up in a different way. I'm actually looking for the effects on perception and the effects on fabrication, remember. So I begin to really clock, with these ways of looking, there is less fabrication. What I perceive, what appears, depends on the ways of looking. These ways of looking fabricate much less. How much less? I just keep going with them, and I will realize that with, particularly with, less so with the anicca, more so with the dukkha, but even more so with the anatta, they really can take me deep into an unfabricating, a state of much, much less fabrication. And because I'm connecting fabrication and ways of looking, I start to understand phenomena are empty. And I develop that skill, my range with that, etc., with these three ways of looking, and I see more and more phenomena dependently arise. They're empty of inherent existence. And what that does is actually then you come kind of a little bit full circle in the understanding. Then it kind of, I've started with ways of looking just as something I'm kind of just seeing what will happen, because I agree, you can look at things in different ways. Then because I see their radical and total emptiness, I come back to ways of looking in a way that kind of gives the whole idea and practice of ways of looking a validation at a whole other level. Because things are thoroughly empty, we're left with nothing but ways of looking. They don't exist independent of the way of looking. I look this way, I see a phenomenon like that, this appears. I look that way, this appears, something different. Through all the gradations there. So this whole journey into emptiness liberates and legitimizes and opens up the whole possibility of a mode of conceiving of practice as a playing with ways of looking. But let's go into this a little more in specifically. So either through playing with or some understanding in practice of emptiness, or actually through developing jhana practice. For instance, just the first 3 or 4 jhanas, even just that. if one really gains some mastery in the jhanas, one of the things that you can do is, where there is pain in the body, you can just decide to see it as bliss, as or as happiness or pleasure, and the perception, the appearance, the sensation, the Vedana actually changes. So either with jhana practice, with what I would call moving towards a kind of mastery of jhana practice, so not everyone will teach this, what I'm talking about now, and or through some understanding of emptiness, you come to realize just how malleable perception is. And that's intimately related with ways of looking business. So here's this pain in my knee or my back. This doesn't happen. This is not possible all the time, every time. But just the fact that it's possible quite a lot of the time really can make an impact on the understanding and on the being. We just come to see how malleable the perception of a Vedana is. So dukkha, as in what the Buddha calls dukkha, just the dukkha of pain, starts to get relativized. Is it necessarily that? No. I can look at it and see it, feel it as something different, as actually as pleasure, as bliss, as piti, as whatever. Further into the understanding of emptiness, one begins to see the emptiness as a set of all phenomena, anything, even a micro thing, a mental thing, a momentary thing, whatever. One sees the emptiness of all phenomena and also the emptiness of time. So seeing all that together, understanding it, feeling it, sensing it in one's practice, where does that leave the notion of, let's say, impermanence as a truth? Where does it leave that characteristic? If time is empty and things are empty, can I really talk about the impermanence of things? Even micro things, even a moment of Vedana. It doesn't really stand up as an ultimate truth anymore. And what can happen as I take this whole ways of looking, these three characters, I take them deeper in practice, is so much fruit can come out of those ways of looking if I really take my time to develop them, the art and everything that they can involve. But either from the emptiness understanding, the deep emptiness understanding and radical emptiness understanding that can emerge, or through what we've been calling sensing with soul, it's quite possible to regard or that the kind of adjudication of something being dukkha or the phenomena being dukkha, we are able to say and really mean it and to sense it as perfect. I talked about that when I talked about, for instance, my illness and my cancer and possibly dying, and this sensing with soul of the whole situation and all of it as perfect. It came out of the sensing with soul. But we can also arrive at that through emptiness practice because of the malleability, or, as I said, see it as bliss. And some of you who are familiar with vajrayana teachings will recognize that, seeing all things as bliss. All phenomena are bliss. And there's different levels and kind of colours of what that means, which I won't go into right now. But these seeings become possible. And the dukkha of finitude, what I call the dukkha of finitude, things are unsatisfactory because they're just finite and limited. Because they're finite in time, so things are dukkha, unsatisfactory because they're impermanent, but also because they're limited. We feel a thing, we sense a thing, whether it's an outer thing or an inner thing, a subtle thing or a gross thing, as having hard edges, rigid edges, as sharply defined. That's in our habitual perception of things for the most part. And so there's a dukkha just because things are have a finitude in time, they're impermanent, and also just because, well, they can't satisfy because I'm going to want something different. I'm going to outgrow this thing, whatever in my desires or whatever. So they're unsatisfactory. But again, either through sensing with soul or through a deep emptiness understanding, we begin to see and sense things, or we can possibly see and sense things as infinite. Yes, remember that soft edge, elastic edge of the way things appear to us when we sense with soul. And because of the whole soul-making dynamic, the eros pushing further the image and the logos, the psyche and the logos of this phenomena, whatever, it's no longer finite. It's now infinitely expandable, infinitely dimensionalized, etc. Or when we see its emptiness, we see these hard edges that separate it from all else, from us, from other phenomena, etc. They are illusory. So, because a thing then can be seen no longer to have this unsatisfactoriness that comes from finitude, we can also look at it and say it's not dukkha. It's perfect, it's bliss, it's divine. And similarly, we can look at something, and of course we can see its impermanence, but again, either through seeing the emptiness, as I said, the emptiness of time, or the emptiness of phenomena, or through seeing it iconically, sensing it with soul, and then that timeless, eternality aspect that I talked about, we could just as well, again, see it as the opposite. It's impermanent, but it's also somehow eternal. So just as we can see it as dukkha or completely not dukkha, the opposite of dukkha, we can see it as impermanent or not, or somehow eternal, iconic. These are all ways of looking that become available to us. The very characteristic flips into its opposite, or seeing not self, or there is no self, or whatever. We become free, having seen the emptiness of all phenomena, and then the emptiness of all self-views. We become free to entertain, to play with, to enter into any self-view, It all becomes available because they're all empty. It's not like this self-view is okay, the self-view of the self as a process is okay, but the self-view of the personality is an illusion or something like that. Actually, any self-view. So again, we can move from anatta to atta, from no self to self, and we're just playing. The ways of looking are just opening up there. So this lakshana, as doors or gates rather than truths or goals. They're doors to, as I said, to this avenue of less and less fabrication, and to the understanding, the radical understanding of emptiness that comes out of that, and then the liberation that comes out of that. What is liberated when I see the deep emptiness of things? And we can then still use them in their more limited meanings and ways. When I see when I contemplate the impermanence of things, when I put that lens on, adopt that way of looking, and I also somehow know that time is not real, actually it can go even deeper in terms of its liberative efficacy. Impermanence is not real, and I'm still looking at the impermanence, and it goes to a whole other level. Or I can veer away from the impermanence, just see the eternality, or the total emptiness, or whatever. There's all kinds of possibilities. One of the possible meanings of lakshana is the act of aiming. It's the act of aiming. So it's not the goal of the aiming, or the target. It's the act of aiming, the truth of the goal. Again, I don't want to. I'm really not into playing that game about etymology and insisting on this or that. But I view etymology more poetically and just as something to play with. So there's that meaning as well, But it's possible in aiming, in the act of aiming, that aim the arrow then takes us somewhere. It goes on a journey, and it emerges even eventually in what appears to be the opposite of what I was originally aiming at. And that kind of turning around of original teachings is very common. Some of you will know in Vajrayana teachings. So about the treasure of the kilesas, or as I went into with the 3 characteristics here. Lakshana in Sanskrit can also mean the sign or the line that one draws. In other words, one draws on the ground prepared for a sacrifice, or on sacrificial ground. So again, we can say it's a kind of creation. It's not a reality, it's a creation. It's a way of looking rather than a facticity. It's a creation to make or discover or to open holiness. And again, I'm not insisting on some historical fact of etymology there, but there is that meaning also. So, with these 3 original characteristics, dukkha, anicca, anatta, it's almost like they can become their opposites. Again, not as truths, just ways of looking. So, when we're talking about ideas in the bigger picture, we can also talk about what ideas we have of perception. What are our ideas about perception? How much are our ideas about perception? Again, just kind of not well considered, received from legacy or influence of the dominant culture or the history. What are our ideas, or what are the possible ideas then, if we get more conscious of it and turn that soil like I talked about? What are the possible ideas we can have about perception? So again, we can have perception as just we have the idea, either unconsciously or deliberately. We can go into it. Idea of perceiving is you just perceive what's factually there. You perceive the truth of reality out there in the world, etc. Remember when I talked about different skillful modes of sensing? So there's an overlap here. And that's a skillful mode of sensing. I need to do something in the world. I go through it. I just go into a mode sometimes of it's just fact. It's just a kind of automatic mode. But I could have another idea about perception, which is, again, with the ways of looking, the purpose is to deconstruct. This is what the Buddha was getting at. Deconstruct. You should destroy the aggregates, he says. Deconstruct them through the way of looking, so that there is an opening eventually. So there's less and less fabrication, and eventually an opening to unfabricated. And one goes beyond the world, so to speak. Lokutara in Pali. So that's a whole other idea about perception. That perception is, a delusory construct, or certainly a problematic construct, and one can break free of it or see through it, so to speak, and go beyond this world of avijja and fabricated perception. Or, again, touching on what we've already touched on, one could say that one is kind of perceptions in the service of just, operating in the world and coping with the world. I kind of just mentioned that. Or the idea about perception is that there's a play that's possible, an art that's possible, and the creation and discovery of all kinds of landscapes and vistas, appearances, perceptions, experiences. For what? For the sake of soul-making would be another view. There's many possible views, ideas, concepts about what perception is and what it's for, etc. So one possibility is that it's the playing with perception in the service of creating and discovering what is soul-making, and opening up soul-making. And contrasting what I just said a moment ago about one whole attitude and idea related to perception is that it's just reality. It's just a kind of one wouldn't use the language, but it's just flatly perceived. That's what the truth is. That's what the fact is, and one is just coping with that. That's the skillful sensing with soul. Versus actually, and I think I shared it once in a talk about healing the perception of the world. So that concept of tikkun olam, healing of the world, or restoration of the world, can also mean restoration of the universe. We hopefully are engaged in acts and service and speech and behavior that heals the world. But there's also the level of healing the perception of the world, redeeming it from soullessness, flatness, lack of divinity, lack of beauty in the perception. So yes, hopefully we make beautiful things in the world, we offer beautiful things, we speak beautiful things, we sing beautiful things into being, but also in the eye of the beholder, in the creation discovery of soul-making perception, we can create beauty and heal the perception of the world. I talked also, this is, I'm pretty sure it's a repeat from some earlier retreat, but we talked about, again, different possible ideas about perception, or ways of, if you like, understanding or conceiving of what perception is. And by that I also mean what feeling what perception is. Again, what I'm talking about is not abstract. So one can actually have a sense, a felt sense of, and a conception of perception as gift and grace. And by that I don't just mean the passive receptivity of the sense organs to the impingement of vibrations of air to make sound, or photons or waves of light on the retina and all that. That's simple receptivity. I mean gift and grace as well, in all the fullness and the open-endedness of what that might mean when it's infused with soul, gift and grace. So something we're receiving, as I said, sometimes it feels like the soul has designs for us, or gives us something, and we receive a certain perception from soul. Some experience opens up, some way of relating to the world is given to us. So there is that real felt sense and conception wrapped up with a felt sense of perception as gift and grace that's possible. Or one can put the emphasis more on my work, if you like. So gift and grace, a second possibility of a conception and a felt sense of perception is as work. Because of the potential malleability of perception through ways of looking, I can work in the moment, and practice is possible. Work is possible to fabricate or unfabricate or shape perception of self, other world, etc. And again, what for? What for? What's the end there? Always back to this question, what's the end? What do you want? And that might vary in different situations. That's part of what a larger view of skill might mean. So gift and grace, as a conception, felt sense of what perception is. Work, perception as work, something that I work at, something that I am working at, something that takes a bit of effort. But also as opportunity, as a third possibility. And opportunity comes etymologically from porta, which means door. So perception as a door, as we said with the three characteristics, doors to possibilities. Now that's implicit in the whole idea of working, and maybe even in the idea of gift and grace, because there's an opportunity to know perception as gift and grace, or as participation in the divine. That's another sense of, perhaps a refinement of the gift and grace idea. We're participating in the divine through our perception. I've touched on all this before, I'm not sure when, but so participation in the divine in our existence is certainly through embodied action, but it's also through our perception and our experience itself. Ancient teacher from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Maximus the Confessor, his name was, wrote, God, the divine Logos, wishes to effect the mystery of his incarnation always and in all things. The divine wishes to effect the mystery of its incarnation always and in all things. And we can hear that and take that word incarnation loosely, or with a lot of breadth as to what it might mean. But we can also, and part of that is we can hear the divine wishes to affect the mystery of its appearance, of its appearing always and in all things, always and in all things. Whatever the perception is, there's this possibility through our participation, through all this, either the gift and grace, or the opportunity or the work of perception, through our participation, we participate in the divine, which wishes to effect the mystery, to appear, to incarnate, always and in all things. And in a way, that's, one could say, the whole point of tantric teachings. The whole point of vajrayana is, from a certain point of view, you could say, is to see appearances as divine, which is how a Buddha sees them. To become a Buddha, which means partly to see appearances as divine. It's just in the Vajrayana tradition, as we've received it, it may be that they're kind of relatively circumscribed, or limited, and generic kind of options for what that actually is then experienced as, what that divinity, how that divinity is experienced, or the kinds of experience of divinity. And in the work that we're doing, Sensing the Soul, we're actually opening up more possibilities, potentially infinite possibilities. So, when we talk, if we go back to the three characteristics, we can consider them as fact, we can consider them as kind of ways of looking that are in the service of and for the sake of deconstructing, unfabricating. And the question is just, how deep do we go down that avenue? How deep do we go with those ways of looking into deconstruction, into unfabrication? And there is the possibility to go very deep with that, or just a kind of very limited depth of unfabricating. And we can go so deep with them that they begin to deconstruct themselves. Impermanence it begins to lose its meaning. It begins to be revealed not as an ultimate truth, etc. And the others too. And then they themselves, those three characteristics, are kind of loosened as concepts. And here we have again an instance where a journey of deconstruction, a movement of deconstruction, can then, when it goes deep enough, then makes available the opportunities for reconstruction, as perceiving of divinity, of sacredness, of bliss, of perfection, of eternality, etc. Those kind of opposites, which are very commonly found in Vajrayana teachings.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed,